This is Jeffrey Ryman again. Today we're going to be talking about multi-engine flight scenario 2. I'm going to kind of skip the introduction for sake of time and kind of get right into the material. So this flight, we're flying a cross-country flight with two friends from Indianapolis, Minnesota down to Dallas, Texas for a football game. One friend that we're flying with seems to be a little bit apprehensive about flying, and the other one is more inquisitive. I'm going to take that as to be kind of excited or asking a lot of questions, trying to get a feel for aviation. We're going to talk about single pilot resource management and some emergencies that we might encounter. So first, let's talk about automation management. First, there's three key skills that we need to consider when dealing with automation management. One is going to be the information that we receive, or information management. The other one's going to be managing the automation itself, so autopilots and things like that. The other one's going to be risk management, because there are some risk factors that go into automation management. So automation management, what do we need to know first? First, we need to know how to fly the airplane. Before we can really get into and become a master of our automation, we need to first learn how to fly the airplane using those common stick and rudder skills that we practice day in, day out to get our ratings. We need to know how to do that in the airplane before we get into the automation. And we also need to make sure we avoid over-reliance, because relying too much on automation can in fact hamper our abilities to make good decisions and also fly the airplane. And then the other thing we need to make sure we do is avoid, even though we have all this information and automation helping us out, that VFR and IMC scenario that's killed so many pilots. So let's talk about information management. First, the electronic flight display offers an abundance of information, right? So it gives us everything from NEXRAD radar to other weather services to TAFs, winds and alofts, lightning strikes, all kinds of different things. But we need to understand that even with that abundance of information, there's also some limitations to that information. So NEXRAD in particular, which is next generation radar, that's considering, are some of the limitations there is that information sometimes up to 20, even more minutes old, depending on how the information was obtained by the airplane. So we need to know that if we're trying to use that to navigate around thunderstorms, something like that, it's probably not going to work very well for us. Not as well as just looking outside the airplane. So we need to be very cautious about that. We also need to understand what the electronic flight display is doing behind the scenes, or what we're asking it to do. And I spelled this wrong, but we also need to understand, I'm going to just make a copy right here, understand the system settings and personal preferences too. Some people like to track with north up, some people like to track with track up, and I've noticed a lot of that is generational as well. So we need to understand how to change those personal preferences, what the system settings are, just in case we get into an airplane and we don't like the system settings, because that can, again, hamper our ability to fly fly properly and utilize this electronic flight display to its full potential. The other thing we need to understand is there is a level of risk when flying with an electronic flight display over, let's say, some kind of other flight display. And the big one is complacency. Because we have all this information coming in and we think we're able to make sound decisions based off that information, if we don't understand, first off, its limitations and things like that, then we might also become complacent on that information. So we might take off, go flying, and say, we'll see what the weather looks like as we get a little further down the road, and rely on our electronic flight display to give us that information. And that really is a complacency thing, where we could have done that pre-flight planning on the ground and realized that there's a cold front moving in and a low-level trough out in front of it, and if we do go flying, we might not be able to make it back down to the ground. Just because the weather looks good out there and then we get up in the airplane and the weather still looks good, the weather on the ground could be changing drastically below our feet and we would never even know it. Also, part of the risk is monitoring the automation to ensure it's doing what it's asked. So if we're using things like autopilot and we're in heading mode and we're flying for a little ways, and then we put it in nav mode and now we're tracking a course, and then all of a sudden the airplane goes into roll mode, and we're not paying attention and monitoring the automation, then we might fly off of our course a good little ways. And if we're flying IFR or VFR in mountainous terrain or something like that, we could find ourselves a long way off course because we're not monitoring our information properly. And those are some risks that come in when we're using automation that don't necessarily come into play when we're hand flying the airplane and things like that. So it's something to be aware of and something to definitely monitor as you progress throughout your flying. Let's talk about the fuel system in the aircraft that we're going to be flying. And we're just going to talk in general about multi-engine airplanes. So one thing to know is that the engines are closer to the fuel tanks in multi-engine airplanes than they are in single-engine aircraft. Now this presents some kind of a hazard because if you have fuel leaks, the fuel can start leaking very close to a very hot source and cause a fire. So we need to be very proficient in our engine fire drills and those emergency procedures and be ready to utilize them should we have an issue. We also need to make sure we do a thorough pre-flight to make sure we're checking to make sure there's no fuel on the ground below the wings or anything like that that might be a precursor that would maybe let us know that, hey, there's a hazard here, and if I don't notice the hazard, I can't mitigate the risk. So we're going to be looking for those types of things. The other thing is understanding how the cross-feed system works. So the cross-feed system in a multi-engine airplane allows fuel from, let's say, the right tank to feed the left nacelle or the left engine, and vice versa. That left wing or left fuel tank to feed the right nacelle or right engine. And understanding how to properly use the cross-feed system is very key to flying multi-engine airplanes. One thing to know about cross-feed systems is the lines are normally pressurized by gravity, just like they are in the Cessnas we're probably used to flying, where the engine subs underneath the engine there are pressurized. So are the fuel cross-feed lines, and they often cannot be shut off due to pressurization. So if there is a fire and you are cross-feeding, there could be pressurized fuel still going to the engine that cannot be shut off. So you need to land as soon as practical or immediately if necessary. We're talking about fuel management. First thing is it's very important to do cross-feed checks as applicable per the pilot's operating handbook for the airplane. But some things to keep in mind is during cross-feed, we need to make sure we run our engine ups to about 1,500 RPMs for about 1 minute to ensure the cross-feed is actually working and we're not still running off residual fuel in the lines from our normal feed of from the fuel. And the way we do that is we just run it up to about 1,500 RPMs for 1 minute or whatever your POH suggests. Then once complete, we discontinue the crossfeed and allow that engine to continue running to make sure that crossfeed that has stopped is not just residual fluid coming through and that we're actually feeding the engine off the main tanks or the tanks on the proper side. So it's very important that you do that because the last thing you'd want to do is do a crossfeed check, take off, and then realize that your engine is actually starved of fuel. Let's talk about what would happen if we were doing an emergency landing without power. First thing to consider is it's always important to manage your power and manage your energy state. So keep the flaps and gear up so we have that clean, streamlined profile flying through the air and we're not creating a lot of drag. And then the landing gear is the first thing to come down, but only once the airport is assured to be made, because we want to keep as little drag as possible to make sure that we can make it back to the runway. Then we're going to manage that energy state and try to make sure that we have enough energy to get down to the airplane or down to the ground, but we don't want to be too high either. So don't be scared to pull that power back and start your normal descent coming down. And once the airfield is made, then you can go full flaps and start your normal descent down to the landing. Things to keep in mind. I think Martha King said it best in the ground school, and that's fly standardized. Okay, don't do anything super special here just to make sure that you create a new emergency later because you didn't fly properly. So fly standardized. Use the same pattern altitudes and air speeds as a normal landing. This time you're just doing it with one engine and operative. Do not aim for the numbers, right? Aim about a third of the way down the runway. That way you assure yourself enough space to land should you not manage your energy state properly. So aim for about a third of the way down the runway, just making sure you have enough room to stop as well. It's important not to stay too high either, because if you're too high, then you have to kind of dive and drive it down to the ground. And it's important that we don't want to have to do a go around. So we want to be nice and stabilized coming down. The next thing we want to do is make sure we maintain at least VYSE, or a single engine best rate of climb speed, until the runway is assured. That way, in case we do have to do a go around, we're not still losing a bunch of altitude. And then neutralize rudder trim if used to keep that airplane flying straight, or pressure when the power's pulled back, because we're no longer going to have that thrust coming off of that engine that's powered. We'll also talk about aeronautical decision making. So part of aeronautical decision making is always the plan, the plane, the pilot, the passengers, and the program. So in this situation, I'm going to assume that the pilot had a good plan. He's familiar with his plane because we just talked about it. The pilot is good to go, but one thing that we have here is passengers. So we need to make sure we talk to our passengers about what we expect from them and how we expect them to handle it. Part of the passenger briefing that we do here at Aviation Adventures is the safety brief. So we do the seat belts, air vents, fire extinguisher, exits. We talk about traffic, and we ask them if they have any questions. Inevitably, somebody's first time flying, they always have some kind of questions. But the big thing we talk about is how to point out traffic. So we use hands on a clock, 12 being forward, 3 is to the right, 9 is to the left, and 6 is out the back, and then everywhere in between. We tell them just tell us high, low, or if something's not going to be a factor for us, meaning that we're not going to have a collision with them, just tell us no factor. So make sure your passengers have a clear understanding. Your passenger that's maybe a little bit nervous, let them know, hey, if you have an issue, if there's a problem, just let me know. I'm going to let you know if we have a problem. And we're just going to fly the airplane. It's going to be an enjoyable time. I'm not going to do anything crazy. We're going to try to stay high so we're out of the turbulence, or low so you feel closer to the ground. Whatever's appropriate that makes him feel more comfortable. Talk to him about what happens if he starts getting motion sick. Tell him to look at things out in the distance or just have a conversation with him. And your guy who's excited, let him be excited. Let him have a good time. Talk to him about the airplane. Explain things to him. He's probably going to want to pick up aviation on his own if you have a good enough time. Share the excitement with him. Just make sure he knows that he can't be a distraction to you during critical phases of flight, like the landing and takeoff phases. But other than that, when you're in cruise flight, have him ask all the questions in the world. Make sure he's having a good time and enjoying himself. PAVE stands for the PIC, which is you, the pilot. The aircraft, which is the aircraft we're flying, making sure we're good on fuel and we're done a thorough pre-flight and everything's happy and it's capable of the mission that we're doing. We're in weight and balance, which I'm assuming we did. The environment talks about what the weather conditions are going to be like. We're assuming we're leaving out of a pretty cold climate to a warmer climate. No. To a warmer climate. And then we have external pressures. So external pressures are going to be getting to that football game, trying to make it there on time. We need to make sure we manage those external pressures. One way to do that is leave a little bit early. Tell your friends, hey, let's leave a day or two early. Just in case we can't make that flight, we can come up with some kind of other arrangement to get us down. General aviation is only successful about 90% of the time. The other 10% of the time, we want to have a nice backup plan. And then the I'm Safe checklist. This goes more towards the pilot in particular. So we're going to talk about the pilot. Is he ill? Is he taking medications? Is he have any undue stress? Has he drank alcohol in the past 8 hours? Is he a .04 or still have side effects from drinking the night before with his friends? If so, it's a no-fly situation. Is he overly fatigued? Did they spend all night last night, partying, having a good time, maybe not drinking, but still having a good time, so he's super tired? Or is there a huge emotional attachment to this football game where, he can't, focus on the things that are important? Wrapping up here, these are the references I used. I talked about risk management, using the risk management handbook, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and a little bit from John and Martha King from the multi-engine school and the ground school portion. I hope you enjoyed this video. It went a little bit long. I'm sorry for that, but I had a lot to cover. Tried to talk as fast as I could, stumbled over a few words, but without further ado, we wrap this up. Have a good night, Professor.